Now, to further expand this conversation with us, we are joined by Musa Mdunge, who's a political analyst. Musa, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Now, we could possibly see members of the National Assembly being sworn in this coming week. But apart from a desire of a government of national unity announced by the ANC, there's not much progress with regards to a way forward in terms of who's working with who in the 7th administration. And the clock is ticking. Should we be concerned as South Africans?
Good evening, Katleho, to you and to your viewers. Certainly, look, the elections have posed to South Africa's political elite certain unique challenges that they have not faced in the past 30 years of our democratic project. And certainly, South Africa is moving into a new gear in which we will no longer have a one-party dominant system that provided in the past 30 years the kind of political stability, certainty, and predictability when it came to policy. Unfortunately, where we are moving now is we are moving in a space where all of that is out of the window. And so we must look to the way the ANC has managed this process and has understood this dilemma that the country finds itself by proposing as its first shot a government of national unity. And I think it is quite interesting to hear the responses. And I think it is something we will, of course, get into in the discussion of the opposition parties. And for me, their response to the ANC's proposal really highlights what the ANC endeavored to do in pushing this proposal, seeing its own dilemma and a choice between the DA or the MK vis-a-vis EFF would have posed internal fractions within the party. It decided to put the ball in the court of the opposition parties to say that you guys have a decision to make, whether you will put the interests of the Republic of South Africa first by putting aside your differences for the greater good, or will you turn to tribal lines? And if so, what it will advocate or what it would validate for the ANC is that it is still critical and important as the most central party in the country in holding the center. And I think from that perspective, Katleho, I think the ANC were very smart in proposing a government of national unity.
Well, in that proposal, Musa, I mean, the UDM leader has come out and spoken to my colleague Masake Gana earlier on, calling on the Chief Justice to hold the hands of politicians in establishing this government of national unity. Do you think that that's a bold step to take from the UDM in shifting sort of that dynamic towards the Chief Justice as opposed to the ANC fully taking this on themselves?
I find it quite unique, Katleho, that the UDM leader would choose such an approach. Here is a man who has served in parliament since 1994, who had served in the first administration. Surely he would know full well as a senior member of parliament that in this country we believe in the separation of power, in which the president is the leader of the executive, where the judiciary is led by the Chief Justice, and the legislative arm is led by Parliament through the Speaker. And in this case, given that we have some sort of a machination of a Westminster system, it is through Parliament that the executive will finally find its expression through the election of the president and through his ability, therefore, to set up a cabinet. And so it is the parties or those who've received enough votes to enter parliament who then must decide on who will form or who will be elected as the president of the republic and therefore be the one whom will appoint a cabinet. That is for parliament to decide. To ask the Chief Justice to step into this would be an encroachment of that very delicate and important line of the separation of power. And in many ways, I'm not surprised that some parties would go through this way, because if we study the history of South Africa's politics in the past 10 to 15 years, our courts have played a major role in deciding on dealing with gridlock, whether it comes with how the executive exercises their constitutional powers or how the parliament has held the executive accountable. What we must stay away from is a judiciary that will play an overexerted role and encroach in the step that really lies within the legislative and within the executive. So I think it's a wrong move, but it is indicative of the political crisis that we find ourselves in.
Speaking of that and the reactions that you mentioned earlier on with regards to the different political parties and to the ANC wanting a government of national unity, I mean, the DA and the IFP have expressed that they were looking forward into being brought into this GNU. However, the MK party and the EFF have come out to reject the GNU, saying that the DA cannot be a part of this, but they still continue to engage with the ANC. What is most likely to be an outcome out of such a situation?
Well, look, I think you kind of hear it in the language. There's almost an inconsistency in the language from these parties. Clearly, there is an appetite to enter government. The challenge is, what are the kind of things that these parties can draw out of a negotiated settlement? The first point here is to understand that no party got a majority, which means we're in a place where the people of South Africa have called on all the parties to work together. So perhaps to merge what the UDM have done in the positions of this party, of these parties, is what needed to happen, in fact, from the president, was he should have really called a meeting of all political parties who have got seats in parliament as per the results of the 29th May election. And from there to then decide on what will constitute the rules of how do we get to this place of a government. And that is what should have been decided here. For the EFF, Katlego, if I may mention, they really are in an interesting position, because if we look at their result, they certainly lost ground to the MK party. But if you listen to many voters, one of the things that they were they didn't trust the EFF on is really on the issue of their border policy, which, if you think about it, there's a misalignment with their position on borders vis-a-vis their position on economic policy. As a socialist-leaning party, you would expect that they would lean closer to a strengthening of borders. So from that point, they really need to examine where they lost votes. But secondly, they've always had a crisis of not having a record of governing. So it will be interesting to see the EFF and the MK let go of an opportunity to govern, to show South Africans that compared to the ANC, compared to the DA, the black parties to the left can produce certain results. And this is why we ought to vote for them come 2026, 2029. So parties are going to have to think really closely about their interests, how they're positioning themselves towards 2026, and most importantly, 2029, and the maturity by which they come to this process with. It will be telling with whether voters can trust them in the future. And I think at the back of the mind, this is what parties should be thinking about.
Musa, on that point of governing, I mean, a big concern is the 7th administration being constituted within the time frame that's set out by the Constitution, and the danger of parties scrambling for certain strategic positions as opposed to truly carving out a way that will work better or in the best interests of the country. Are there any future lessons that we can learn from countries such as Germany, who take 4 to 5 months post-elections negotiating things such as a coalition?
You know, certainly, Katlego, you raise a very good point there when we look towards Germany and how they have handled their political arrangement, in which it is a country where coalition government is the name of the game. And because they believe in the importance of stability, the importance of thinking through the kind of government that will best work and serve a plurality of interests within the country, they take time to think through these things. And so certainly, given the fact that we are new in this space of coalition politics on a national level, and given that we should have learned certain lessons on the local government and our experiences there, surely you would have thought that parties would have thought deeply about perhaps a constitutional amendment that seeks to change the manner in which, or the time frame in which it takes to constitute a government, but secondly, a constitutional amendment or a law of general application that would guide us in the manner in which coalitions are constituted. Because central to what the UDM are sort of calling for in terms of seeking out this sort of third-party adjudication or mediation in this process is to say, we don't have a way forward. How do we do that, given that, number one, we don't have an agreement on the rules of engagement? And if we don't have an agreement on the rules of engagement, how do we get to that place in 2 weeks where we can confidently sit before the people of this republic who have elected us and say, we are confident as members of parliament, in accordance to Schedule 2 of the Constitution, that as we take our oath, we take it in recognizing that we can get there to a place of presenting a stable government that can move South Africa forward.
Musa, I've completely run out of time, but I really want to squeeze this one quickly in. I mean, earlier in the week, Action SA announced their exit from the MPC and rather focusing on being an opposition. The UDM leader mentioned earlier on in terms of the space of who will then become an opposition. And within HGNU, the position of an opposition government is by its nature very small. What does this make of the role of that watchdog in such a leadership?
Well, this is going to be interesting because they raise a good point that while there may be accountability within the executive for the first time, that we mustn't forget that parliament remains very much important, and having a strong opposition is key in holding government accountable. And I think a strong opposition will become even more important as in such a time as this. So certainly there are questions that will be raised, and I like the thinking of leaders like Musa Mdunge, who's really thinking about what kind of a strong opposition do you have, and that nature of that opposition, how important it is for driving accountability and transparency in the manner in which the executive will exercise their executive power.
Okay, Musa, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for such a robust conversation, as we always do have. Thank you for your time. That was Musa Mdunge, political analyst.